computer work out okay. Right. Okay. My presentation is going to be on pre-hospital in Africa. I chose this topic because I work as an EMT, and it's really interesting for me to see how it works in this region and semester. If this load, there we go. Okay, so the current availability of emergency medical care in Africa is very spotty and varying. So some countries have pretty much non-existent systems, and other countries have some of the best systems in the world. So we're going to talk about a couple of those. I don't have time to read everything on these slides that I put, so if you're interested in this, just go ahead and read over them. I studied Tanzania a little bit. It's one of those countries where if you live in a big city, you might have some coverage, but out in rural areas, you pretty much have little to no coverage at all for pre-hospital emergency care. Ghana actually has a very good system set up. Almost everything is covered, and their national ambulance service is what they call it. It's actually free of charge, which is a lot better than even American systems do, because for the average patient that I transport in my ambulance, they get like a $2,000 to $3,000 bill minimum. And so I think it's really cool that Ghana has no charge for that. Their system was actually set up in part through the American National Registry of Emergency Medical Technicians, which is also something I found very interesting. South Africa is one of the countries that actually has the best response in the world. They've got intensive training for their providers. They've even got national diplomas. They're pretty widely renowned in the emergency medical community as being some of the best. Zimbabwe used to have a pretty good system. Sadly, that has been neglected a lot, and it's now more like Tanzania is, in the sense you may have coverage in some places and you may not in others. Kenya, so there are a couple of pre-hospital emergency care training centers. I forgot to mention this earlier, but these show availabilities of medical services and diseases. So you can go back and look at those maps for that. Morocco, there's not a whole lot that's actually known about Moroccan emergency medical services or responses. Pretty much it's just what comes through the government, but they were planning on having it pretty good. Okay, so common issues with emergency care. This is where I want to kind of talk about urbanization. So we know that less than half of Africa's population lives in urban areas. There are fewer emergency services available in rural areas. There's not a lot of people, and there's fewer situations in general that require emergency services. Care can also be really hard to provide for rural areas because you get really long response times to get to a patient, to get to a hospital or other facility. A lot of emergency care is time sensitive. It's an emergency. So that leads to more rural deaths from the same causes that will kill fewer of the urban population. And an example of that is cardiac arrest. You can go ahead and read through that. There's a wider availability of emergency and medical care in urban areas, which I think definitely makes it a pull factor for urbanization. So Africa's urbanization, we learned in class that the projected percentage is going to go over half for the population that will live in urban areas. I think this is a really good thing when it comes to emergency pre-hospital care, because a greater percentage of the population will be closer to hospitals. They'll be closer to training centers and educational facilities, as those things are often centralized in urban areas. You'll have more people in the cities that will be able to help staff, and you'll have more centralized communications and operations. So public health in Africa, it's a big crisis for a lot of countries there. it's made by stuff like conflicts, too rapid urbanization when the infrastructures start failing, or underdevelopment. There's a lot of factors for that. According to the text, there's about 9 out of the top 20 countries with the highest rates of emigration by healthcare professionals from Africa, and 36 out of 57 countries with critical shortages of healthcare professionals are African countries. So auto accidents, I'm going to go into a couple of different public health things that have a big burden on Africa. So auto accidents are a big one. They're actually one of the leading causes of death. And the leading cause of death for people ages 15 to 29 years old. And in 2015, the African region actually had the highest rate of fatalities in motor vehicle crashes. And see, 85% of all deaths, 90% of all disability adjusted life years lost from VCs occur in low or middle income countries, even though they only have 47% of all registered vehicles in the world. So countries with faster ambulance response time, they experience lower MVC fatalities as compared to ones with longer response times, like many countries in Africa. Maternal and infant mortality. The maternal mortality rate as the infant mortality rate. You can see Africa has the highest rates worldwide for both of those things, which is another big public health problem. Cardiac disease is actually another big cause of death for especially Black Africans. And the reason for that is missed diagnoses. There's a lack of qualified professionals and a lack of diagnostic equipment to be able to detect these diseases, and then they don't get treated. Mental health is another big problem in African countries. It's one of the leading causes of disease burden, and it's also at the bottom of priorities in many policymakers' decisions because people just don't know what it is. They kind of have outdated mental health beliefs. And so the disease burden often falls on traditional healers and religious organizations. Hospital availability and travel distance. Hospitals, as well as emergency services and pre-hospital care, are all understaffed and under-equipped in many places. Increased transfer distances to hospitals result in increased mortality rates, and that is especially true for people with respiratory or cardiac emergencies. So what could better pre-hospital emergency care look like for African countries? I see it as having uniform education and professional standards for emergency medical care and for pre-hospital emergency care in every country individually, uniform standard of provided equipment, government funding to ensure proper equipment and pay for employees, and maybe even incentives for people to join various emergency services, such as guaranteed pay, making it not volunteer, health benefits, assistant programs to pay for housing or education or the training for the job, stuff like that. Here are a few of my works cited. You're welcome to go look at those sources. I hope that this was interesting for you guys. I did through all of the stuff. The last time I tried to do this presentation turned really long. Sorry if this one's pretty rough. Thank you for listening to my presentation.